Well, today on this Back to Church Sunday, I wanted to have happiness as our theme, or perhaps what we talk about in the church more as joy. Happiness is more dependent on feelings, but joy is the experience of the presence of God, regardless of our circumstances. I'd love to have you hear a story that was sent to me this week by a friend of mine who occasionally sends inspirational stories out, and I really love this one. This is by Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, if you happen to read that book or perhaps saw the movie that was based on it, of her memoir of spiritual searching. Some years ago, Elizabeth Gilbert, the author of this best-selling book, Eat, Pray, Love, experienced a minor miracle of attitude transformation on a New York City bus. Here is how she described what happened. I was stuck on a crosstown bus in New York City during rush hour. Traffic was barely moving. The bus was filled with cold, tired people who were deeply irritated with one another, and it seemed with the world itself. Two men barked at each other about a shove that might or might not have been intentional. A pregnant woman got on and absolutely no one offered her a seat. Rage was in the air and no mercy would be found here. But as the bus approached 7th Avenue, the driver got on the intercom. "Folks," he said, "I know you have had a rough day and you are frustrated, and I can't do anything about the weather or the traffic. But here is what I can do. As each one of you gets off this bus, I will reach out my hand to you, and as you walk by, drop your troubles in the palm of my hand, okay? Don't take your problems home to your families tonight. Just leave them here with me. My route goes right by the Hudson River, and when I drive by there later, I will open the window and throw your troubles in the water." Well, it was as if a spell had broken. Everyone burst out laughing on the bus. Faces gleamed with surprise and delight. People who had been pretending for the past hour not to notice each other's existence were suddenly grinning at each other like, "Is this guy for real?" And at the next stop, just as promised, the driver reached out his hand, palm up, and waited. One by one, all exiting commuters placed their hand just above his and mimed the gesture of dropping something into his palm. Some people laughed as they did this, some teared up, but everyone did it. The driver repeated the same lovely ritual at the next stop, too, and the next, all the way to the river. "We live in a hard world, my friends," she goes on. "Sometimes it is difficult to be a human being. Sometimes you have a bad day, and sometimes you have a bad day that lasts for several years. You struggle and you fail and you lose jobs and money and friends and faith and love. You witness horrible events unfolding in the news and you become fearful or withdrawn. There are times when everything seems cloaked in darkness. You long for the light, but you don't know where to find it. But what if you are the light? What if you are the very agent of illumination that a dark situation begs for?" That's what this bus driver taught me that day, that anyone can be the light at any moment. This guy wasn't some big power player, he wasn't a spiritual leader, he wasn't some media-savvy influencer. He was a bus driver, one of society's most invisible workers. But he possessed real power, and he used it beautifully for our benefit that day. I love this story, and I think I might argue with her that he wasn't a spiritual leader, because he clearly changed the atmosphere in that bus for the better. It was a demonstration of what we would call agape love, that invisible, invincible, benevolent goodwill that has the ability to transform moments. As we worship together today, what kind of a message do I want to convey? Well, I thought it should include, as it really should every week, joy and happiness. But it particularly came to mind this week as I was watching one of the morning shows, and I saw an interview with a social scientist named Arthur C. Brooks, who is author of a new book with Oprah Winfrey titled Building Your Own Life, The Art and Science of Getting Happier. Well, I was intrigued by the introduction they were giving, and so wanted to hear what he had to say about happiness. Now, they wrote this book as a response to polling that Americans are an anxious people right now. And whatever the sources of our discomfort and discontent, everyone is seeking greater happiness in their lives, according to this polling. Even though we are a happier people, by contrast with most of the rest of the world. Not the happiest by any means, but we have a lot to be grateful for and things that might normally make people happy. But nevertheless, everyone wants more of that. And these authors asserted that that is possible and provided some helpful roadmaps in this book. Now, some changes can happen immediately, others require time and commitment. I would point to that bus situation as one of those moments where something changes immediately. Somehow the ice is broken, the tension of a moment. That can change in a heartbeat, and it can transform many other things that follow. Now, the book, though, asserts that we can't find happiness in chasing after feelings, and I very much agree, or things that will just make us happier, but rather our happiness, or I would say our joy, a more bedrock state of being, is a combination of three things: enjoyment, satisfaction, and purpose. And their research has shown them that we find these things as human beings in relationship with each other. It doesn't happen in isolation. And the four things that are bedrock to our joy or satisfaction in this world are faith, family, friends, and work that serves others. Our work can be paid or volunteer, can be long-term and ongoing, or short-term, a simple project or experience. But to satisfy our longings for joy, it needs to benefit others. We are built to love. And the author talked about all of these things: faith, family, friends, and work, and the relationships that sustain them. It's all about love. All these relationships thrive or wither on our ability to live in harmony, and that requires a constant tide of transgressions and acts of forgiveness. Big things, little things. Living in a state of unforgiving spirit can tear relationships apart more quickly than many other flaws. And so we have this remarkable story, this parable of Jesus this morning, where he actually exaggerates more than we might imagine when we hear the story for the first time, because there are terms of monetary measure that in Jesus' time would have meant certain things, and for us it doesn't speak the same way. So I looked into that a little bit, and Jesus is giving us a story where there's symbolic people, and God is symbolized by the king, the very forgiving king, but also the arbiter and the judge in this situation. We have a story of a slave who owes this king I think it's 10,000 talents, and the calculations that economists have done based on what they know about the ancient world is that Jesus gives an astronomical figure. This is equal to 200,000 years worth of wages. So in other words, he is exaggerating to make a point about the forgiveness that God is capable of when we ask for it. It's like the, trillions of dollars. And so we see the forgiveness that God sheds on this first slave and how extraordinary it is. But then that guy, who's just been forgiven, turns to one of his buddies who owes him money and grabs him by the neck, cuts off his oxygen and says, "Unless you pay me what you owe me, I'm going to have you thrown into prison until you can." I've never understood debtor's prison, by the way. How do you pay things back when you are in jail? Does not make sense to me. But nevertheless, this slave who has been given this gracious, gracious forgiveness cannot show even a modicum of graciousness to his colleague. Now, the man who owes the other slave 100 denarii, that's about 4 months' wages in our terms today. So while that's a considerable amount of money for any of us, it's not beyond a person's reach. Nevertheless, he is so stuck on himself that he's going to demand this of another man. And as soon as the other slaves see this encounter, this injustice, this lack of gratitude and graciousness and mercy on the part of the slave that's been forgiven so much, they take it right back to the king and they say, "You'll never guess what that guy did with your forgiveness. He just throttled another guy who owes him far, 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 far less." And so the king calls that fellow back and chastises him and throws him in prison. And then Jesus ends the story saying, "This is the depth of God's forgiveness for you. But the measure you give is the measure you get, and unless you show that kind of mercy, you are not in line with God's offerings to you and God's expectations of you. You give as good as you get." That's what you're supposed to do as Christians. It's a pretty startling image, and I'm sure that it hit the mark when Jesus told others, because the story begins, of course, with Peter asking the question, "How often am I supposed to forgive somebody?" And Jesus says, not 7 times, as Peter suggested, but 77 times. In other words, there's no bounds to your forgiveness. And by the way, there are really no bounds to God's. When we ask for forgiveness earnestly, God will forgive. His grace is sufficient for all our needs, even the most difficult times in our lives. Pastor David Willis says this about forgiveness. "Holding a grudge doesn't make you strong. It makes you bitter. Forgiving doesn't make you weak. It sets you free." And that is true. Forgiveness sets everyone free. It sets the person free who has done the wrong. It sets us free from holding that negativity inside us and stifling our happiness, our joy. So I ask you as we close today, how can you recall a time when you were an agent of illumination? As Elizabeth Gilbert talks about the bus driver. Or else, have you witnessed or benefited from another small, subtle act of illuminating the world? Remember how uplifting the effect of that was when you recall it? We all need God's forgiveness for the wrongs we do. And we all need to ask for it from time to time, often frequently. Your light is needed now. And the good news, the God news of Jesus' parable this morning is that we can access the light of forgiveness every time we remember the breadth of forgiveness that God has for us. Every time we acknowledge the wrongs that we have done. We don't have to be hostage to the negativity that was on that New York City bus, in a state of grudging silence with these people, a state of unforgiveness, where each must have been harboring something that had gone wrong, and they were all just upset about it. They were in a state of burdened spirits, where the oxygen was thin. Forgiveness brings the oxygen back into our lives. Elizabeth Gilbert notes at the end of her story, when life feels especially grim, or when I feel particularly powerless in the face of the world's troubles, I think of this man, this bus driver, and I ask myself, what can I do right now to be the light? Of course, I can't personally end all wars or solve global warming or transform vexing people into entirely different creatures. I definitely can't control traffic, but I do have some influence on everyone I brush up against, even if we never speak or learn each other's names. No matter who you are or where you are or how mundane or tough your situation may seem, I believe you can illuminate your world. In fact, I believe this is the only way the world will ever be illuminated. One bright act of grace at a time, all the way to the river. My friends, as we think of ourselves, we need to remember that our light is needed now too. Every day, in every moment. And that we can make a difference, a positive difference, even in the darkest moments and situations, because we know Jesus, the light of the world. And that is sufficient to all our needs. That is the source of our joy. Thanks be to God. Amen. As we remember our offerings this morning and acknowledge them, I would like to sing a song for you that I have sung before, but it fit very well with our theme today. This is the wonderful song, You Remind Me, by David Roth. You remind me that I'm always forgiven. You remind me that I'm always loved. When I try too hard and feel so empty, you remind me that I'm good enough. When that devil doubt is racing before me, sprinkling eggshells of distrust and disarray, you are rolling out your carpet of forgiveness, and you give me solid ground to find my way. Now I know that there are times I get distracted, and I know that there are things I didn't do. But the universe is perfect, and I know it. And the reason that I'm sure of it is you. Did I forget to leave a flower on your altar? Did I forget to say how much you mean to me? This is my bouquet of recognition for every gift and grace you've helped me be. You remind me that I'm always forgiven. You remind me that I'm always loved. When I try too hard and feel so